Welcome to Avatar State of Mind, a podcast exclusively dedicated to the universe of Avatar The Last Airbender. From The Last Airbender to Legend of Korra and the comic books in between, this is your number one stop for Avatar content. I'm your host, Sam DeCoste, and I am joined by my friend Aaron Miller to spend the next 30 minutes with you talking about Zuko's honor, underground libraries, the Air Nomad civilization, and so much more. So sit back, grab a cup of tea from the Jasmine Dragon, and enjoy the show. This is Avatar State of Mind. Welcome back to Avatar State of Mind. We are here at episode 5 already. It's hard to believe, Aaron. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I just realized this. We're on episode 5, and we're looking into episode 5 of book 1.
That is correct. Yes, but thank you once again for joining Aaron and I on Avatar State of Mind. We're going to continue our series-long recap of Avatar The Last Airbender by spending each podcast episode talking about individual chapters of the series. We'll break down every chapter of Avatar in order from books 1 to 3, from The Boy in the Iceberg to Sozin's Comet. Previously on Avatar State of Mind, we talked about the Southern Air Temple and the Warriors of Kyoshi, chapters 3 and 4 in book 1. Next up is episodes 5 and 6, The King of Omashu and Imprisoned. Before you listen any longer, let this be your final spoiler warning. Do not listen to the show today unless you have listened to unless you have watched the first 6 episodes of Avatar. Ideally, the whole show. If not, the 6 episodes will do just fine. But, Aaron, to start our discussion today, I wanted to ask you about the city of Omashu. Where does it rank in terms of all the cities in the Avatar series? Because it's got to be up there.
Out of just the Earth Kingdom or out of every single city?
Well, start with the Earth Kingdom, but then branch it out to the entire Avatar universe where it ranks.
Okay. Honestly, out of the Earth Kingdom, I think it ranks as number 1. I think the city of Omashu is better than Ba Sing Se because it has features of Ba Sing Se where it has like the walls that the Earth benders could move. But when I've watched this specific episode of Omashu so many times, but when I watched it this morning, Omashu looks so much like an air temple. I think it's insane, and I think that's why I like it the most out of any Earth Kingdom city, because of how much it resembles the Southern Air Temple. I mean, there's one entrance, it's up on a hill, and you could really only get into it if you go up like that winding path. So
those are some good points. Also, when you compare it to Ba Sing Se, you have pretty much no corruption. You don't have the Dai Li there. There is a king, but the king knows what he's doing. King Bumi is not the Earth King. No Dai Li. There's also a much higher standard of living across the whole city, whereas you have the lower and middle ranks that really are a lot of people just there to make lives for themselves, whereas Omashu is a much wealthier city. Aesthetically, though, and culturally, this has got to be probably a top 3 city in the world, in the Avatar universe, in my opinion. It's definitely number 1 in the Earth Kingdom. I would say, at the top of my head, it's only behind the Northern Water Tribe.
Yeah, I know how much you love the Northern Water Tribe, and honestly, I'd have to agree with you. But your point about how there's no corruption in Omashu, I'd have to disagree. Even though King Bumi he's a wonderful king. I think he's probably the best leader in the Avatar universe, especially during like this era. But do you remember when the Earth Kingdom guards in Omashu were talking to the cabbage merchant? I believe this is the first time we actually see the cabbage merchant, and I don't remember exactly what they do, but they're honestly very ruthless and like mean towards this like merchant who's trying to make it for himself. I think this foreshadows that the Earth Kingdom are just so fed up with this war, and that everybody involved is just so mean, and like, I don't know. I just, from watching this happen, I didn't really get a good look at Earth Kingdom soldiers.
That's a good point. And I was also thinking about how Omashu and their protocols are handling everything about the war in terms of national security. I think about how, because this is the most civilized society that we have seen in Avatar yet. In the fifth episode, we've seen the South Pole, which is 10 people, with Sokka being the eldest man. We see the southern air temple, where it's not even inhabited, and then the Kyoshi Island, which is just a few warriors and a few kids living on the island. But let's go into the actual episode. And we were alluding to how they are very ruthless in Omashu. It's ironic because Aang said this is the friendliest city in the world when he introduced it to Katara and Sokka. Yet they are abusing a cabbage merchant, and they're yelling at Sokka to carry his fake grandfather's bag as they enter the city. So clearly, as I was trying to allude to, the war changed Omashu so much because of how they have to be cautious of who they let enter their city, what they let enter their city. So that's probably the reasoning behind how Omashu is handling their security.
And I imagine that with this 100-year war, that Omashu has had some kind of attack happen to it. So they've obviously seen the 600-day siege on Ba Sing Se, so they can see what the Fire Nation could do. So they're just taking every precaution they can. But I think it's just so funny that all it takes is an old man he is an old man, but like dressed as an old man, pretending that he needs to get into the city, and that the guards don't really pay any attention to it, when really a Fire Nation soldier could do the same thing and they probably would have been let in. So
the tubes and chutes for the mailing system is really cool. It is so cool. And we could see coming that Aang was just going to ride them, because as I said last episode, this is just Aang's world and Sokka and Katara are just living in it. It's another example of them just appeasing Aang, just Aang taking Katara and Sokka wherever he wants, seeing all of his old stomping grounds around the world. Because Aang, as an air nomad, could travel the world, and he befriended so many people. People from 100 years ago could not be as sociable as Aang was. He befriended so many people across the world, including Bumi, when they were both 12 years old, including, what's his name? Kuzan from the Fire Nation. He knows so many people around the world as an air nomad visiting the vast Earth Kingdom city of Omashu. It's very ironic that when he does go to Omashu and he gets arrested, that it is the king of Omashu that was his best friend from Omashu. That's really cool.
Yeah, and I think that I never really thought about this until right now when you were talking about it, the mail shoots. Aang loves just like writing like things. Like he's on Appa 24/7 being transported. As soon as he saw Katara, he's like, you want to go penguin sledding? And then he goes to this mail carrier thing, and he's just like, let's go ride this. Like, and I'm pretty sure there's other occasions throughout the show that this also happens, but it just shows how much of a kid he really is. And this show, the progression of Aang going from like this kid who just wants to have fun and like ride like a roller coaster ride into being a guy who has to fight the Fire Lord, it's magnificent.
The roughhousing sequence where the gang is riding the mail chute off course and disrupting the whole order of the city is vintage book one. You have the delightful chaotic music in the background. You have them going off course, nearly getting stabbed by some knives behind them on the cart. That was a great scene. I personally love that scene. It's just so innocent. And also keep in mind, in these two episodes, there's no Zuko and there's no Iroh. No Zuko and Iroh, no Fire Nation chasing down the Avatar. So it's just our glimpse of this expanded world that we're getting to know more and more as the series is starting to find its footing. So then we see the king, King Bumi, and to put it as Katara did, the king's crown is a little crooked. Only the king could pass down judgment, is what the guards said when they were arrested. And then you could first get a glimpse of how nuts this guy was when he says, throw them a feast. And everybody was like, what? Everybody. And also, this happens the whole episode, but there's this subtle organ music overlaying in the background. It's very amusing, and it sets the tone brilliantly for how this king is just absolutely bizarre.
And the way that he's dressed is insane. So, I mean, like, Bumi is shown in this show plenty of times after this episode, but he's never dressed like he is in this episode in the future ones.
No. And I'm sure you recall when Aang's tests began, before he even did the first one, he asked, what do you think of my outfit? I'm waiting. And it was just this flaunting purple fur outfit with hat horns on his head. It was very strange. But then, obviously, he goes into the challenges. Now, I have to say, I noticed this much more observantly this time around watching this episode. Boomy is savage. He is a savage trash talker. So he does 3 challenges. The first one is trying to get his lunchbox key that's just hanging from this valley in a waterfall, and Aang has to get it, saying things like, climb the ladder. No one's thought of that before. Keep diving in head first to the water. I'm sure it will work eventually. Even during the duel, he says, did somebody open the windows in here? It feels a little drafty in here. When he's referring to Aang's airbending.
Yeah, Boomy is one of my favorite characters in this entire show.
Seeing him just, before we know that he's actually going to become an ally, seeing this crazy old king just play games with the Avatar, it's so funny. And beyond the first challenge, he has to save this pet named Flopsy. That kind of screams the chaos and discord of this episode, that he has to fetch this giant bear dog thing, and then he finds out it's actually the guy that he's calling for, and then he lays down as the organ music is playing, and he's saying, oh, who's a good Flopsy?
and Flopsy is just like this overfed giant monster, and Boomy knows it because how crazy he is himself.
The highlight is obviously the duel. The duel is the highlight of this episode. And arguably, Aang obviously the writers made him fight Boomy, but it was a pretty horrible decision for Aang not to fight either of the 2 fighters. They looked pretty weak. Who knows if they even bend, first of all. There's some guys with makeup holding swords. And then he chose Boomy, who obviously looked like an old man. And Boomy left him that loophole to fight him, but obviously it wasn't the best decision for Aang to make.
Yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the first time we see earthbending in the series, right?
I believe you're right.
Yeah, and the first time we see earthbending in this entire show is by who's regarded until we meet Toph as the best earthbender in the world. Like, I believe Boomy even says himself, I am the most powerful earthbender you will ever see. And that, like, it's just funny that we see this episode where earthbending is introduced and it's most powerful, and then the episode we're going to talk about in a few minutes is with a not so advanced earthbender. So it shows both sides of the spectrum.
I think this is coming to my head. Toph and Boomy would make an amazing earthbending duel, wouldn't it?
That would be fantastic.
We could talk about that at some point in another episode. Who would win, Boomy or Toph? But anyways, we digress. This is a true exhibition of Aang's one-on-one combat skills, and he takes Boomy on. It's a matchup between an airbending master and the most powerful earthbender in the world to this point, which makes for an amazing fight and vintage Avatar combat.
Yeah, and I mean, air and earth are opposite elements. So it's like the water to the fire. It's showing that this very physical bending of earthbending to this very like nomadic way of airbending can go hand in hand. And it also shows that even though Aang and Boomy are the same age, they're 100 years apart. It shows that even though Boomy's had 100 years to master earthbending, Aang is just as powerful.
And using the tornado to use Boomy's strength against him, Boomy's very powerful. He's so strong, and he's also nuts. Remember the part where Boomy folded, falling behind into the ground and ascending back into the stand where Katara and Sokka were? That's correct. Boomy is just off his rocker this whole episode. He's never really off his rocker this much, but it does fit into character with what we see from him in the future, because we do see Boomy again as the series goes on. We see him in each book all the way to the very end. And obviously, before we even meet Boomy, we meet 12-year-old Boomy in a flashback with Aang when the world was at peace. And you don't even hear him snorkel with his laugh until Aang knows who Boomy is. We don't hear him snorkel with his laugh the whole rest of the episode. And I think if he did, Aang would have known who he was, because that's such a defining characteristic of Boomy, to Aang at least. Also, this is our first instance of hearing the Fire Lord's name. I believe you were going to bring that up.
I was, yeah. So this episode is very, very childish. It's very just like a having fun episode. Honestly, I believe like if you look at this episode and the two episodes that are on each side of it, the animation looks a little bit different. I don't know if you've noticed.
Oh, I do. I've noticed it.
Yeah, and what I'm thinking is that I looked it up. I couldn't really find anything on it. I'm thinking that this episode was meant to be used as like a pilot, even though there was an unaired pilot. This seems like this episode was made before the episodes before it, just because of like the animation looks a little bit more amateur compared to everything else. And this episode is just, it's to show every part of the Avatar universe. There's earthbending, there's airbending, and just to show how much fun the overall episode is. But right after the battle, right after Boomy tells Aang, or once Aang finds out who Boomy actually is, he gets super serious and he looks directly at Aang. You see them looking at each other, and Boomy's like, yeah, you have to get serious now. You have to master the four elements. You have to fight Fire Lord Ozai. And yes, like in the entire show, the Fire Nation is mentioned, the Fire Lord is mentioned, but never heard about Ozai until now.
And it's the first time Aang really understands that his duty is to defeat the Fire Lord, and that's how the war will be won in the end. To defeat the Fire Lord, it sets the platter at last for what Aang actually needs to do as the Avatar. And also, the episode caps with a scene of Boomy and Aang riding the mail chute together as Aang's challenge for Boomy, and that's a very fulfilling, innocent way of ending this episode, because it does set the foundation for Boomy and his character, because he is relevant the rest of the show. But in the scheme of things right now, in Chapter 5, this did not add to the plot very much.
No, not at all. I mean, the only thing that really added to the plot was talking about Ozai, and they could have easily thrown that into another episode. That's why I'm thinking that this episode was meant to be a filler, and it was also created before they had the storyline completely down.
And I definitely see your point. There's definitely a possibility of that, that could be true. So that's the King of Omashu. It is one of my favorite episodes, at least of Book 1, because of how we get to see King Boomy and seeing him off his rocker the whole time, and seeing Aang really exhibit how powerful he is, because we don't really understand. It is a misconception because everybody in the show, including Zuko, Zhao, even Katara and Sokka, kind of think this guy's a 12-year-old kid. He's a very unrefined avatar. You assume that his airbending is not even very good, but he is the most, obviously he's the last airbender, but even if all the airbenders were still alive, he might have been the most powerful airbender in the world.
Oh, absolutely. I think, and that comes down to the people who trained him. I mean, Monkey also trained him, and then also like all the other monks around him. Aang was in the perfect situation, because you can argue that Aang lived in the greatest time of the Air Nation, being trained by the best. So him being the last of the best, just...
So that's King of Omashu. Let's move on to Chapter 6, Imprisoned. So this is really what makes this episode great. It's not regarded as one of the best episodes in the series, not even Book 1 maybe, but this episode truly gives us our first taste of how the Fire Nation truly oppresses the Earth Kingdom. Mm-hmm. We see, well, first of all, we see this young Earthbender practicing in the woods as Team Avatar is just camping for the night, trying to find food. And then when this young Earthbender realizes he's being watched practicing Earthbending, he retreats immediately and covers his path so no one is able to follow him. But this is how we see the Fire Nation oppress the Earth Kingdom village, doubling a store's tax and threatening to destroy people's homes and shops and places of business, using the town's coal mines to fuel Fire Nation ships, and taking advantage of everybody and forbidding earthbending in the village and arresting every earthbender there and taking them away, including the father of this young earthbender. And his name is Haru, as we all remember. They talk about the day of the invasion, how the village was outnumbered 10-1 with the invading soldiers. And we also see a very strong connection between Katara and Haru, because they both bond over how they feel disconnected from their cultures, how they feel discouraged from bending and expressing themselves, and from missing their parents, who Katara's mom obviously was killed by the Fire Nation, and Haru's father was imprisoned.
Yeah, and this episode and the episode where Zuko invades the South Pole, and the second episode, I believe it was, they overlap, and they're so similar in so many ways because it shows that the Fire Nation isn't stopping at destroying the Air Nation and oppressing the Water Tribe. It shows that they're actually wanting to take over the entire world, even breaking into this Earth Kingdom. And we know that from the map in the intro of every single episode that the Earth Kingdom is the largest, so it'll take much more energy to take it down compared to the others. But it shows that the Fire Nation has a really good strategy, actually, of creating individual colonies within the Earth Kingdom and recruiting Earth Kingdom citizens to join in and enslaving them to win the war that they started.
And we do remember that Haru was taken to prison and he was busted for earthbending. If you don't remember, what happened is Katara and Haru were taking a walk. They noticed this old man buried by rocks at a coal mine, and the only way for the old man to be saved was for Haru to earthbend the rocks out to save him. And he did. Figuring no one's watching, this man is going to die. I'm going to earthbend. I'm going to save his life. And then he turns him in to the Fire Nation. What a snitch.
Yeah, but the thing is, though, is Haru didn't even want to save him. I think that if him and Katara didn't go for that walk, that weird, strange, romantic walk they went on where they were blushing, I just didn't get that entire scene. But if Katara wasn't there, I don't think Haru would have saved the man, because he understood what could have and what actually did happen by showing his earthbending.
But also, and I get what you're saying, still, even though the consequences were high, that it was a very high-risk situation just to go earthbending, he was saving a man's life. No matter where he stands, how can you repay your gratitude by turning a man into a ruthless Fire Nation prison? Because if he didn't bend, he could have died. He would have died. Sorry for saving your life, Boomer.
The thing is, though, is I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but when they're on the rig and Katara's trying to talk to all the old earthbenders to try to get their morale back up, they were just all so defeated. They thought this war was over. They actually said they wanted to wait out the war because they knew they were going to be freed afterwards, which I don't think would have happened. But I believe this old Boomer, this dude who was trapped and was going to die, he knew that the Fire Nation was never going to let up. He knew that he could have been thankful to the little kid, or he probably got a big reward. There was probably some kind of system where if you turn in any bender that's not a firebender, you get 1,000 gold pieces or something. So this old guy was honestly just only caring about himself at this point.
That's probably true. And also, since we're on the subject, let's talk about this. Hashtag Karu, Katara and Haru. Thoughts? No?
Absolutely not. I don't think Haru was established enough in this specific episode. Like, yes, we learned a little bit about him, but especially when they use Haru later on in the show for the Day of Black Sun, and they talk about him even going into Book 3 and right before Sozin's Comet. Haru, I think the creators and writers of the show failed with his arc. He was kind of just like this side character. I honestly think that Jet, who we meet later on, had a better storyline than Haru.
So you don't think romantically they would have been a good match?
Absolutely not.
Really? Because they bond so much. They have so many reasons to be a really good emotional connection, but you're dismissing it just right away. You don't believe in this relationship at all.
Well, their connection was based on loss of a parent and disconnect from their society. And I mean, once Haru's father is reunited and all the earthbenders are brought back, their connection is no longer there.
All right, well, I see that you just hate love, so we're just going to move on from this conversation. Let's talk about the fake fight that Katara and Sokka have. This is just pure gold comedy. Calling, Katara called Sokka a giant-eared cretin, and she said it, emphasizing each syllable very clearly. Giant-eared cretin. I bet elephants come together and make fun of how big your ears are. You can't. This is peak Avatar comedy. Also, Aang forgetting his cue to even have the earthbending, and then the Fire Nation soldiers thinking that Momo was the one who was earthbending, not Katara. Wow. Okay.
And the fact that Katara screamed earthbending style not once, but twice. And
I said earthbending style.
and the thing that got me the most about this episode is I will never get over the fact that Sokka and Katara are wearing Water Tribe outfits and nobody notices. The Earth Kingdom citizens don't notice, and especially the Fire Nation soldiers don't notice that they're wearing Water Tribe outfits. Like, as soon as you would notice that, you would notice that these people are out of place, that Katara is no way she can be an earthbender. I like it later on in the show when they get out of the waterbending outfits and then they can actually blend in.
I agree. Now let's talk about the prison, because we get our taste of Fire Nation oppression over a village. Well, now we see what the Fire Nation actually does to their prisoners, and it's brutal. It is not. It's obviously not the highest ranking Fire Nation prison. That doesn't come into play for a very long time. But this is a prison deserted in the middle of the ocean in just some shipyard. We also have a George Takei cameo voicing the warden. Very nice. Excellent performance, Mr. Takei. But we see the warden bending at a helpless prisoner who coughs during his introduction, sending him to week-long solitary confinement. We see it's a metal prison because metal bending was not in existence yet, so that was the way to inhibit their bending. Awful prison food, shortage of blankets, sleeping outside in the cold. The plan is to survive and wait out the war. And you could see on the faces of all of these prisoners visual hopelessness. They have no hope for the future of ever getting out.
Yeah, and we discussed this a little bit earlier too. I don't yes, the prisoners were hopeless and they're going to wait out this war. But if the Fire Nation won, why in the world would they put earthbending citizens back into society? If the Fire Nation won, I'm confident that they would have killed these earthbenders. I don't think they would have released them back. It's just how ruthless the Fire Nation is. And I think the thing that got me the most, I know this is super, super simple, but the warden of this rig said that earthbending was savage. All these people were savages because they weren't Fire Nation. And this just shows the superiority that Fire Nation citizens thought they had over everybody else in the world. It's very, very, I hate to say it, but it's very Nazi-like.
Well, it's discriminatory, feeling that your style of bending puts you superior over others. Even though fire is probably the worst element, it's mostly destruction. It is life, but even the masters of firebending like Zhang Zhan admit that they are burdened with this power that they wish they never had. But anyways, at the end, Katara's speech giving couldn't fulfill people with hope enough. Everyone's just so starved of hope. She's so committed to bringing hope to everyone that she risked staying in the prison to free Haru and right the wrong that she did by making Haru bend and basically get arrested. And then Haru is the person that starts the earthbending and fights back. And then once Haru does it, because initially, even with the coal in the prison, no one wanted to earthbend. But Haru stepped up, and then Haru's father stepped up, and then the rest of the prison said, all right, it's game on. And then they went after it, and they broke out of the prison, and they threw the warden and the Fire Nation into the water, and they can't swim, but cowards do not float. So that was the end of them.
Cowards do float.
Are you sure?
Yeah, the quote was, I hear cowards float.
But do you think he did? Do you think he survived?
Me watching this show for the first time as a 6 and 7 year old, I really hope he floated.
I think we all kind of hope he did. And then at the end of the episode, we see Katara lose her necklace, her betrothal necklace, given from her grandmother to her mother and to Katara, but she lost it. And then the last shot of the episode is Zuko holding it at the prison rig. First of all, how did Zuko even know that it belonged to Katara? Was he that observant to notice that Katara was wearing a betrothal necklace when they met at the South Pole?
Yeah, personally, I don't think that he was observant enough to know right away. But I mean, if you connect the dots, it's Water Tribe. Typically, female members of the Water Tribe would receive this from male members. So I think that he made the connection. But like, yes, this scene is crazy because it shows how close Zuko is behind the gang and behind them and with chasing them down. But I don't entirely understand the significance of him finding this necklace. Like, yes, later on he uses this necklace for uses. I don't want to spoil anything, but in this specific moment, I didn't understand the significance of it.
Well, that is the end of Imprisoned, and that is the end of our 2-episode recap for today. 2 episodes that are not necessarily admired as much as others in this universe. In Book 1, King of Omashu is very good. Imprisoned is not as revered, but these are crucial in setting the foundation for establishing and expanding the Avatar universe and really showing us how the Fire Nation exerts their stamp on the world in oppressing other cultures, especially the Earth Kingdom, which comes into play the whole first season. But that is the end of the recap, unless you have anything else you want to add about the King of Omashu and Imprisoned.
No, I'd just like to add that I'd say these 2 episodes fall into my bottom 15% of overall episodes. Just because, for me, I'm interested in the lore of Avatar. And yes, we get a little bit about Ozai and a little bit about Bumi and about like the oppression that the Earth Kingdom felt from the Fire Nation and how poor the Earth Kingdom actually was compared to other places because of how big it was and how corrupt the inner cities were. But yeah, I mean, these 2 episodes, they're also slow, and honestly, if you pull these 2 episodes out of the entire timeline, I don't think you'd be missing much.
That's very true. But thank you for listening anyways. Next week, we'll be talking about the series' first 2-part episode, The Winter Solstice. We'll talk about Aang's first journey into the spirit world, talk about their first trip into the Fire Nation. It's really an epic 2-part sequence where Book 1 really starts kicking into high gear, and I'm very excited to talk about those 2 episodes next week. But that is it for episode 5 of Avatar State of Mind.
Thank you so much for listening to this second episode of Avatar State of Mind. We will be back every Saturday with a new show around noon Eastern Time. Subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Follow us on Instagram at Avatar State of Mind and on Twitter at AvatarSOM. And let us know what you want us to talk about on the next show. As much as this podcast is our podcast, we are doing this for the listeners. Let us know where you want us to take this show and what you'd like us to talk about. We're in this together. For Sam DeCoste, my name is Aaron Miller, and thank you once again for joining us on Avatar State of Mind.